All right, let's dive back into the French Revolution. It promised liberty, right? But what happens when that pursuit of an ideal turns into, well, a total nightmare? We're about to walk through one of the most intense, debated, and frankly, bloody chapters in history.
Last video, we learned about how monarchy was overthrown in France and how it came to be a republic. Today, we are going to learn about a key figure of the republic called Robespierre and the Reign of Terror.
And this is the man at the center of it all, Maximilien Robespierre. Now, he was a huge deal in the Jacobins. That was the most radical political club of the Revolution. They called him the Incorruptible because he was so devoted to the Republic. But, and this is a big but, his idealism had a really dark side. He genuinely believed that to build a perfect, virtuous nation, the state had to use terror to, surgically remove its enemies.
And that idea brings us right to the period we call the Reign of Terror. This wasn't just random violence. Robespierre's government put in place a formal policy of extreme control and punishment. In his mind, it was the only way to get rid of anyone against the revolution and build this new, perfect republic he dreamed of.
What's really shocking is the timeline here. This wasn't some decade-long horror show. The Reign of Terror was basically a compressed explosion of violence that lasted just about 1 year, from 1793 to 1794. But in that single brutal year, it carved a scar into the soul of France that has, you could argue, never fully healed.
So who exactly were these enemies of the Republic? Well, this is where it gets terrifying. Robespierre's definition was incredibly broad. Of course, it included the old nobles and clergy, but it also meant members of other political parties, and, chillingly, even people in his own party who dared to disagree with him. Basically, if you were even suspected of not being enthusiastic enough about the revolution, you could find yourself on the list. No one was safe.
And the system they set up to deal with these enemies was brutally efficient. First, you'd be arrested. Then, you were dragged before something called the Revolutionary Tribunal. This was a court specifically set up for political offenders. And if you were found guilty, and trust me, the bar for evidence was incredibly low, the sentence was almost always the same: death by guillotine. And this device, the guillotine, became the horrifying symbol of the terror. The crazy thing is, it was actually promoted by its inventor, Dr. Guillotine, as a more humane and equal way to carry out executions. A swift, painless death for everyone, regardless of class. The irony is just staggering when you think about how it was used. But Robespierre's vision wasn't just about getting rid of political enemies. Oh no. He wanted to completely remake French society from the ground up. And that meant the government started to control just about every aspect of daily life. Just look at the economy. The government put a cap on how much you could earn and how much things could cost. Meat and bread were strictly rationed. If you were a peasant, you couldn't just sell your grain for the best price. You were forced to take it to the cities and sell it at a price fixed by the government. They even controlled the kind of flour you could buy. And this is a perfect example of that control. Expensive white flour was completely forbidden. Instead, every single citizen had to eat something called the pain d'égalité, the equality bread, which was a simple loaf made from whole wheat. The message couldn't be clearer. In this new republic, equality was going to be enforced right down to the very food on your table. It wasn't just food. Even the way people talked had to change. The old formal titles of Monsieur and Madame were completely banned. From now on, you were simply Citoyen or Citoyenne, citizen. It was a constant daily reminder that the old social ladder was gone. Religion was also a major target. The government saw the Catholic Church as a symbol of the old corrupt system. So, churches all across France were shut down. Their buildings were taken over by the state and turned into things like army barracks or government offices. So if you're getting rid of old loyalties like religion, you've got to create new ones, right? That's what these massive public festivals were all about. The government staged them to get everyone fired up and on board. And what's really fascinating here is the symbolism. They would use imagery from ancient Greece and Rome to make it seem like this brand new republic had this grand ancient history. But, and here's a key detail, the structures they built for these festivals, like that huge pavilion, were often made of cheap, perishable materials. They were like stage sets, meant to be put up and taken down, a fitting metaphor for the fragile new world they were trying to build. But as you can imagine, all of this extreme control started a huge debate right inside the revolution itself. As the terror got worse, even the revolutionaries began to ask themselves some tough questions. I mean, they were all fighting for liberty, but what did that word actually mean?
Yeah, what is liberty? Is it something you achieve through happiness, reason, and justice? Or is it a fragile idea that you can only protect through fear, discipline, and, well, terror? And right here, we see two totally different answers to that question. On one side, you have the journalist Camille Desmoulins. In 1793, he wrote that liberty is happiness, reason, and justice. And he gave a stark warning. He asked, how can you send one person to the guillotine without creating 10 new enemies among their friends and family? But just a few months later, Robespierre argued the complete opposite. For him, using terror to crush the enemies of liberty wasn't just an option. It was the fundamental right of the Republic's founder. And this is probably his most famous and most chilling quote. On February 7th, 1794, Robespierre declared, "Terror is nothing but justice, swift, severe, and inflexible." See, in his mind, there was no contradiction. The violence wasn't evil. It was simply the virtue of justice, applied with full force during a national emergency. That's the key point. He saw terror as a tool of morality. But a system built on that kind of brutal logic just couldn't last. And in a classic case of the revolution devouring its own children, the man who built the terror would soon become its next victim. Robespierre just kept pushing his policies relentlessly, to the point where he alienated literally everyone. Nobody felt safe anymore. The list of enemies just kept getting longer, the executions got faster, and even his own supporters started to look over their shoulders, terrified they might be next. Quietly, they began calling for things to calm down. The end came really fast. In July of 1794, his enemies in the government finally made their move against him. He was convicted by a court, arrested, and then, in the most stunning turn of events, the very next day he was sent to the same guillotine that had killed so many of his victims. And with his death, the reign of terror was finally over. So, Robespierre is gone. What happens next? Well, with the Jacobins out of power, the political pendulum swung hard in the other direction. A new government took over, called the Directory, and it had a very different idea for what France should be. A whole new constitution was written, and this time it was the wealthier middle class that grabbed power. The idea that every man could vote, that was gone. Now, if you didn't own property, you couldn't vote. Power was split between 2 elected legislative councils and an executive committee of 5 men, which was called the Directory. The whole point of this new setup, especially the 5-man Directory, was a direct reaction to Robespierre. It was specifically designed to make sure that no single person could ever have that much power again. The problem? It was a mess. The 5 directors were always fighting with the legislative councils, and it led to constant gridlock and political chaos. And all this instability, all this chaos, it created a huge power vacuum. The people of France were just exhausted. After years of revolution, terror, and a government that couldn't get anything done, they were desperate for a strong leader to restore order. And that weakness, that vacuum, paved the perfect path for the rise of a brilliant and ambitious military general who was waiting in the wings, Napoleon Bonaparte. In the next video, we will learn women's role in the revolution.